There's a certain joke, Mark.
There's
an apt joke doing the rounds of Twitter.
There's a joke. Brexit walks into a bar. Why the long farce? Asks the barman.
It's apt, isn't it?
It's
apt,
scary because it's terrifying. It's true, but this process is just turning into something of a debacle. Just before I came on air, I had an email from a reader in London saying that Britain is sleepwalking into fascism. Now, it's not quite that bad, but some of the racist tone of the coverage we've seen, we had a Daily Mail front page accusing the judges of being enemies of the people for supporting Parliament's right to have a vote on this issue. This is a pretty febrile atmosphere and, you know, you're used to divisions around election times. Do you support Trump? Do you support Clinton? Do you support Liverpool in soccer? Do you support Arsenal? But this division is pretty deep.
And as you say, both sides are guilty of exaggeration, half-truths and scaremongering. Is the Remain side, though, Mark, in denial still about the outcome?
There was a YouGov poll, and they polled only people who voted to stay in the EU, and they asked them, where are you on the scale of what's used to measure people who are in grief? 32% said they're still in denial. They don't believe the UK wanted to leave the EU. Only a fifth have accepted that decision.
Yeah,
and the amount of anger is pretty high as well.
It was a pretty stunning number, I thought. We were speaking about this very poll yesterday with Tina Fordham of Citigroup, and she calls it regret. And I know we're all sick of, you know, the phrases, but it's true. People don't regret the vote yet in as much, you know, in as many numbers as you might think they would. But once the economy starts getting hit, Mark, will they then? Or once the NHS doesn't receive any money that it's supposed to receive from these so-called European subsidies, will it then? Or what about when migrants don't stop coming? Because after all, migrants from Syria and Turkey were not the migrants that were causing the great numbers of migration. When that doesn't happen, will they then regret the vote or still not?
Well, if anything, it's going to be slightly worse than that, because one of the things that keeps people in denial is if they think there's a hope that the thing they're in grief about didn't happen. And because we've had this High Court ruling, which will now be appealed to the Supreme Court, that says Parliament gets to vote, there are people out there who think that Parliament is going to overturn this decision, that whatever bill gets put in front of them by Theresa May and the government, that they'll somehow contrive a way to undo the referendum, to not have the UK leaving the European Union, and you're kind of back where you started.
What does Edmund Burke say?
Well, Edmund Burke, parliamentarian, 1700s, he says if you're elected as the MP for Bristol, you're not there to represent the people of Bristol, you're there to represent the country as a whole. And he says you must vote on any bill in front of you for the nation as a whole and not for the interests of the people who actually elected you, which in turn would argue that the fact that a lot of constituencies outside London voted to leave the EU should not weigh upon those politicians. They should be voting in the interests of the country as a whole. And from there, it's not very hard to construct an argument that says if you want your Toblerones to stay the same size, if you want the British trading position to stay the same as it is, if you want financial services in the city to be protected, maybe those MPs should be somehow rejecting the outcome of the referendum. You get into all kinds of constitutional issues, will of the people stuff, but it's not very hard to construct that argument.
Mark, people need to read your piece just for the de Goncourt quote alone. You quote, you know, a French writer in the 1800s who talked about revolution. Essentially, you're comparing this with a revolution.
It's a very British coup. And that's exactly what it feels like. And those divisions are so wide that you don't find anyone in the middle, really. And if you follow some of the traffic on Twitter, it gets very heated, even at this stage. And we haven't even triggered Article 50
And investors
yet.
don't like divided countries,
And
do they?
investors do not like divided countries. And, you know, if the pound is the barometer of what people think of the economic prospects of this country and its management, they're not in favour.